Hi folks, welcome to week 11. We're talking about changing the world this week. As usual, we've broken it down into 4 parts. I'll be talking about political power in this session. Then we'll be talking about resistance and social movements, identity, new social movements and the environment. And we'll finish off with a session that talks about our discipline, sociology, and how it works in a changing world. Today we're talking about political power, and I guess we have to sort of break it down and start from the beginning a little bit. And to do that, we need to talk about state power and the various systems of government that are in operation around the world. I won't spend much time on this. We're sociologists, not political science students, but I'm pretty sure people recognise the different systems of government. At the moment, in most of the minority world anyway, there is various blends of democratic systems of government. There are dictatorships, there are theocracies, there are oligarchies. And I guess I've made a couple of points there just about the fact that the systems of government that are in place in any one nation state isn't really a reflection of the people, but is much more associated with historical forces. The race, the religion, their exposure to empire, wars and peace have often determined the amount of liberalism or authoritarianism that occur in different nation states, and therefore the reflection of their system of government that's in use there. And we often like to think about this spectrum of political ideology, perhaps, and it does come down to us, particularly in the democratic sense, from Europe and European thinkers such as Locke and Hobbes about what liberalism actually means and how that's operationalised in any system of government, and how that shift over time has occurred from the sovereign power and the power of one person in the form of an empire, or an emperor, sorry, and towards a more representative, constitutionally based, open and transparent system of government, usually with universal suffrage of a parliament and parliamentary representation. And I know we often don't like to think in binaries in sociology, but politics is a little bit different, and it's often associated with this sort of typified version of what ideology looks like, and it's on these spectrums of libertarian and authoritarianism, economic left and economic right. And I put this up also for the fact that it's now become so ubiquitous, and our understanding has become so solidified around these types of ideologies about where people sit on these political compasses, that it's become memeified. Most notably, there's a subreddit dedicated to political compass memes that's actually a subreddit that's all about political expression, using this as the basis. So when we're talking about political power, we often think exclusively of parliaments and parliamentary trappings and the 3 pillars of the executive and the judiciary and the parliament. But politics is pervasive. It's not just for parliaments. I think, as we all know, politics is everywhere. And often when we say politics is everywhere, we're not talking about politics. Office politics is a good example of a reference, a social shorthand that we use when we say what we're talking about. When we think of office politics, isn't the associations and political discussions that people have in the workplace. It's about power. Where are you in the pecking order in your office or in your workplace? What's your relationship with your boss like? What's your relationship with other people like? But more formally, when we're talking about the state and state power, Mann has theorised these 4 spheres of formal state power, and they're often connected and coordinated and overlap, but they generally tend to operate as distinct spheres of power. That's the political power that's wielded by the executive and the parliament, the economic power of a society, what's going on in the private sector particularly, what the state is represented like in terms of its military and its police presence, and what the ideological power is going on in society. We can't really talk about political power without talking about institutions, and we have to acknowledge that these are contested spaces. There's dedicated institutions with their own constitutions and their own reasons for being, but they are many and varied. Institutions that we know about, that we're most familiar about, often encompass things like the university, the school, the prison. They're all about us. We operate within them, and they're often the nexus of this overlapping spheres of state power. So the political types of institutions wield a certain type of authority over us. Institutions that are associated with the military operate perhaps in more restricted circles, but those institutions are there to serve the political apparatuses that are sort of brought up amongst them. And there's a tendency to think of these sort of institutions as operating for the people that are at the top of those same institutions. And we know this through personal experience. I don't think that you can live in society without being aware of numerous examples of these institutions where power concentrates at the top, and it represents vested interests. The people that are there, the people that are spending the most times associating with those institutions are the ones that stand to benefit. In the political sphere, we can see this. It's particularly apt that we're in the middle of an election campaign, but in the political sphere, we can see this rotating door between politicians that have acted as representatives in the House of Democracy and a House of Representatives, that then move on into sinecures inside the corporate world. There's an old boys network that exists in media types, for example, institutions that are connected through economics or through politics or through ideological power that tend to serve their own interests. C. Wright Mills has dubbed this the power elite, the people that tend to congregate at the top in the institutions where this overlapping and this concentration of different spheres of power operate. And Michaels goes one further and says that in any sort of complex institution, you're going to have an iron law of oligarchy. The people that tend to inhabit the institutions will congregate at the top and ensure that there's a regeneration of power that goes into their hands for their interests. So as I've outlined, we're talking about a number of different types of institutions, right down to the local. Think of strata organisations in a building where that you have a formal institution that's got a legal structure and whatnot that has very real effects over what you can and can't do in your own home, for example. And when we're talking about these sort of overlaps of power that concentrate inside institutions, we can think of them as assemblages. They have a legal structure, but they also have a very ephemeral structure. They have a sort of omnipotence in the areas that they control, and that they operate by certain rationalities. There is an efficiency when we're talking about institutional thinking about power and how it operates. So, we'll talk about Foucault's governmentality, but the rationalities of governing societies has moved from this monarchical, sovereign type power to a more disciplinary type of power. We're much more inclined to discipline ourselves, our own behaviour, our own thinking, in tune with social norms that are set by perhaps ideological spheres of power. And this term governing at a distance means exactly that. We no longer need micromanagement from institutional eyes that are peering into to determine our behaviour and how we're operating and to correct us if we're not behaving in an appropriate manner. We're doing that for ourselves, to ourselves and with others. We're adopting social norms and ways of being that conform with these overarching rationalities of how power operates. And Foucault was particularly vocal on these assemblages and these knowledges are associated with an expertise. There's been a rise in expertise, particularly the accumulation of scientific knowledge, and they're determining more and more efficient ways that we can implement these self-disciplinary actions on our own behaviour. Health and health benefits have been shown for lifestyle changes that we are all individually responsible for example. The real world benefits of this self-disciplining behaviour has shown that the expertise associated with developments and scientific understandings in healthy bodily functioning means that we're encouraged to avoid certain types of food and avoid certain types of associated health effects. Don't get too overweight. Don't smoke with health disease on the rise. Maintaining a mental healthiness encourages us to sleep and to eat and to exercise in a certain regime. Vitality and well-being is promoted by various people in the media and social media in particular about the types of regimes that they're operating within themselves. I get up at a certain hour, I have a certain breakfast, I then go to the gym, and then I go to work, and then I do the next thing. There's a modelling of a disciplinary behaviour there that they're encouraging other people to emulate, not because they're some part of the state, but simply because they've achieved some of these health benefits that they recognise that they can pass on to others, that gets picked up by popular media. We see this a lot, that certain behaviours that people have particular trouble with can have various types of ideological power framed around them. I'm thinking particularly of the health benefits of red wine or eating chocolate. You hear that they're good for you, you hear that they're bad for you. This expertise and this scientific knowledge is not settled, and yet the message from these ideologically powerful spheres of influence, such as the media, can slant our understanding. So this brings us to Michel Foucault more fulsomely, and governmentality essentially is the name of the political power that's wielded in society. It's done through this mechanism of self-discipline. We're all responsible for different parts of our behaviour, how we operate, the choices that we make, whether they be in the health sphere, whether they be in the mental health sphere. This governmentality, this governing at a distance, this governing through freedom, through liberty, is a deeply it's a deeply socialised experience. We are socialised from a very young age to behave in certain ways that conform to social norms that have come about as a result of governmentality, that have come about as a result of following these rationalities of governing. And often this is associated with the health of populations, the physical health of populations, means a more productive workforce. The socialisation that we have from young children onwards about the need for efficiency and productivity in the workplace or in the school, for example, is conditioning us to sort of embrace what comes next. Often in the school experience, we behave in certain ways in between certain times to gear the individual up and for operating in a society where we need a 9-to-5 work existence to maintain, the productivity, the economic productivity of society. So biopower was what Foucault was theorising around. He called it biopower because essentially we're talking about this healthiness of societies. He spoke specifically about how that affects births, deaths, healthiness in general. Particularly, he examined mental health and mental institutions, what sort of governmentalities were implemented on people that were having a mental breakdown, for example, and what sort of behaviours were modelled for them to make themselves well and for the purposes of being well, to become productive in society. And so with the expertise, particularly in science, these governmentalities are becoming more efficient. We are the most efficient use of our own behaviour. We are particularly efficient at controlling ourselves and our behaviour to accord with social norms. And that is becoming ever more efficient over time. In the health sphere, for example, the rise of technology has developed, apps and smartwatches and stuff that monitor our heartbeat, that monitor our sleep patterns. They're becoming our self-disciplining behaviour overall is becoming more efficient. So, to sort of operationalise this idea of governmentality, you can take something such as the ideological power bestowed in the media, and you can combine that with a political reasoning, which is vote getting. We're in the middle of an election, we're seeing it right now. These two things operate in tandem. There's not necessarily a grand plan, there's not necessarily a grand scheme of things, or an agenda or anything of that sort. Because this political power has permeated our society and has permeated our social norms to have real-world effects on other people. And we're talking about the health benefits of maintaining, good heart health, eating the right foods and stuff. A healthier population is a more productive population generally, with a lower governmental cost. There's a rationality there, sure, but it's a lot less direct than a government person coming out and saying that a healthy population means more productivity, which means an increase in GST and taxes and the development of the nation. It's important to realise though that some of the rationalities of governing means that in these normal operating conditions that institutions, particularly governments and states, have a power of life and death over other people. All things going normal, there's an underlying rationality of government that some people will miss out, some people will fall through the cracks. The mental health system is such that people can fall in between getting service and not getting service depending on where they live. And so the outcomes, the real world outcomes for people can sometimes just be determined on where you fall in the pecking order and other associations that you have with power. Mbembe called this necropolitics. Instead of biopolitics, this is a death politics. This is the power over life and death that's occurring under normal operating conditions in our societies. A really good example of this at the moment is we went through all of our lockdowns during COVID. We went through all of the overt health messaging about people shall do this and people shall do that and people shall do the next thing. And at the moment, it's a lot more laissez-faire. The behaviour of individuals, whether to wear a mask in a public place, for example, is now firmly back on the individual to discipline for themselves. Are they immunocompromised? Should they be wearing a mask in public? That's a personal choice. And so you have societal effects. We have a very high COVID transmission rate in Australia at the moment, and a lot of that is a result of this individualised behaviour. The governmentalities of operating at the moment under COVID conditions means that it's up to the individual to make a decision about how they behave. And as we know, particularly with COVID, health determinants are very, very strongly shaped by social conditions. It's possibly one of the strongest links that the social sciences has been able to establish. The postcode that you live up in, grow up in, your level of education, the job you have, has a very big outcome on how healthy you are and ultimately how long you may live. COVID has been concentrated in disadvantaged groups, and we've seen inequalities even within the health responses to those different groups. People that couldn't afford not to take time off work through isolation, who continued to go to work, have an impact on the rest of us. And that ultimately, we're talking about human health, societal health, overall health benefits being determined by individuals as a result of this sort of governing through freedom, and that there's a lot of contestation in there as well. The governmentalities, the rationality, of governing can sometimes be questioned by certain groups in society, such as mask wearing and vaccine hesitancy or vaccine refusal, that has real world outcomes for other people. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thanks.